The heavy, oppressive exhaustion of a late afternoon settles over our limbs like wet sand, penetrating deep into the very marrow of our bones and leaving us frozen on the edge of a straight-backed chair. We sit completely still, but this is not the spacious, effortless stillness of a deep meditation. It is the rigid, hyper-braced paralysis of an intense, non-stop internal interrogation. Our gaze is fixed inward, our eyes rolled slightly downward beneath closed lids, acting not as soft windows of receptive awareness, but as the cold, sharp lenses of a clinical audit. We are hyper-vigilantly checking our resting heart rate, measuring the exact duration of our inhalations against our exhalations, scanning the lateral muscles of our neck for chronic tension, and tracking the subtle vibrations in our gut with the detached, clinical scrutiny of a software engineer debugging a broken piece of code. We are frantically running a diagnostic check on our autonomic nervous system, trying to mathematically calculate whether we are currently sliding into a sympathetic fight-or-flight spike or resting in a parasympathetic state. We are fully alive. Our cells are performing millions of complex chemical miracles every second, yet we are refusing to simply exist within our own skin because a quiet, tyrannical administrator inside our head whispers that our biology is an unstable, volatile machine that is perpetually on the verge of a catastrophic systemic failure. We are a generation that has institutionalized the sickness of somatic hypervigilance, transforming our hard-won body awareness and polyvagal theories into an industrial weapon of non-stop self-optimization. We no longer treat our flesh, our blood, and our bone as a living, sacred animal to be felt with a gentle and reverent hand instead. We treat our entire physical anatomy as a highly dangerous biological mechanism that must be constantly monitored, hacked, balanced, and supervised by an aggressive mental administrator. We have fallen into a collective neurosis that demands we turn our ordinary bodily sensations, our heartbeat, our digestion, and our primitive survival reflexes into a high-stakes engineering project. The moment we feel a flash of natural anxiety, a temporary constriction in our chest, or a sudden dip in our physical energy on a Tuesday afternoon, we do not allow it to simply be a transient cloud passing through our sky. We instantly pathologize it, tracking it back to specific developmental traumas, checking our wearable health monitors to calculate our heart rate variability, and deploying sophisticated breathing protocols to aggressively override the sensation. We have turned embodiment into a perpetual interrogation room, converting the beautiful, wild wilderness of our flesh into a controlled laboratory where our vitality is kept hostage to a blueprint of absolute physiological perfectionism. The profound, suffocating absurdity of this internal surveillance is that we are living our entire physical existence as the panicked, exhausted machinist of the living organ. If we pull back the clinical tarps of our current narrative, we see that we have taken up permanent residence inside a dark, claustrophobic control room buried deep within the basement of our own biology. We sit there day and night, surrounded by flashing diagnostic screens, heart rate data streams, and dense instruction manuals on nervous system regulation. We hold our breath as we manually try to pull heavy iron levers, twist mechanical valves, slow down our heart rate gear by gear, and realign our energetic channels with tiny mental tweezers, utterly paralyzed by the archaic, subconscious terror that if we take our hands off the control panel for even a single second, our entire physical existence will break apart. We refuse to look up at the cathedral ceiling of our own temple. We refuse to step outside into the sunlight of our uncalculated senses, because we believe that our heart will stop pumping, our lungs will stop expanding, and our nervous system will permanently collapse if we are not actively managing the machinery. Let us trace the cold, mechanical velocity of this optimization trap through our daily somatic micro-choices. We see it when we sit down to eat a meal, our minds instantly computing nutritional macros, inflammation indexes, and glucose spikes, transforming the primal pleasure of tasting the earth into a clinical chemical transaction. We see it in our movement practices, where we can no longer stretch our limbs or run through a field for the pure animal joy of vitality. Every step must be tracked, every posture must be executed according to a strict biomechanical alignment, and every workout must be optimized to maximize our longevity scores. We have turned our breath into a highly regulated chore, counting numbers and matching ratios in our head, forcing our diaphragm into a rigid geometry, rather than letting it breathe with the wild, unpredictable rhythm of the wind. We have become the sovereign administrators of our own captivity, wrapping our skin in the sterile bandages of physiological metric tracking so tightly that our real, wild, and spontaneous biology forgets how to take a single step without checking a dashboard. We are actively suffocating the organic intelligence of the flesh by demanding that it behave like a digital machine, completely blind to the reality that our hypervigilant control is the very predator our body is trying to escape. The deep tragedy of this collective haunting is that the administrative intellect is structurally designed to ensure that the somatic renovation project can never, under any circumstances, be completed. The analytical mind is an error detection mechanism. Its entire evolutionary function is to scan for fractures, to look for defects, and to find the anomaly in the system. The more we train our awareness to look down into our body for stress signals, the more stress signals the mind will actively manufacture to justify its own diagnostic survival machinery. We enter a self-perpetuating, multi-billion-dollar feedback loop of perpetual biohacking, where the very act of tracking our heart rate variability or scanning our tissues for trapped trauma signals to our primitive brainstem that there is a lethal threat in the room. This constant internal surveillance triggers the exact cortisol spikes, the exact jaw clenching, and the exact diaphragmatic contractions we are trying so desperately to cure, forcing us to buy more devices, read more nervous system manuals, and descend deeper into our industrial basement of repair. We are trying to calm an organic lake by striking the water with an iron hammer, completely blind to the reality that the very tool we are using to achieve tranquility is the exact thing that keeps the surface violently disturbed. We are holding our breath, waiting for a state of physiological sterility that does not exist in nature, entirely unaware that while we are down in the control room manually pulling the levers of our biology, the brilliant, unrepeatable miracle of our ordinary human life is turning into dust right before our eyes. To accurately chart the path of this internal grid of somatic surveillance, we must look directly at the archetype that has become the dominant psychological landscape of the modern, highly conscious seeker, the figure of the hypervigilant biohacker, the permanent auditor of the flesh. This is the version of us that has transformed the noble pursuit of somatic embodiment into a sophisticated, high-level defensive weapon against the natural unpredictability of life. On the surface, this individual appears exceptionally wise, deeply grounded, and intimately attuned to the subtle currents of their physical form. They are the ones who can dissect their nervous system states with clinical precision, trace a sudden tightness in their shoulder back to a specific childhood attachment wound, and articulate their internal boundaries using the latest terminology of polyvagal theory and somatic experiencing. They are often praised by their peers as paragons of holistic health, held up as advanced models of what it means to actively listen to the wisdom of the body. But if we descend past this articulate, highly educated surface and enter the private frozen theater of their interior life, we find a human spirit that is completely locked in a state of chronic, agonizing self-withholding. The somatic auditor is not using body awareness to step into the world. They are using body awareness as an ornate shield to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of actual, unscripted engagement with reality. They live under an unexamined, subterranean belief that states, "If I remain the administrator of my biology, if I keep myself wrapped in the safety of the diagnostic control room, I am permanently protected from the messy, uncontrollable risks of panic, illness, failure, or death." They treat their actual life as a biological performance that is perpetually stuck in technical optimization, refusing to step onto the stage of existence under the full glare of the world until they can guarantee that every heart rate variability score, every breath ratio, and every muscular channel has been mathematically smoothed out. They spend decades analyzing the composition of their internal fluid pressures, entirely blind to the reality that they are drying out on the shore of their own calculation, using the very tools of somatic liberation to construct an ironclad fortress of permanent arrest. While the conscious intellect is busy framing this continuous internal scanning as a sign of high mindfulness or deep somatic attunement, our physical body is keeping a remarkably precise, painful record of the immense structural strain required to maintain this posture of administrative manipulation. The body does not understand the narrative of future optimization. It only knows the raw, immediate contraction required to hold back a wave of vital energy. When we perform a detailed somatic mapping of the hypervigilant biohacker, we see that the fantasy of the fully mastered biology has physically engineered our muscles to hold our breath until we become a perfect, sterile mechanism. The primary center of this physical deformation can be felt directly within our brainstem, the occipital ridge and the base of the skull. If we bring our awareness to the alignment of our neck right now, we can feel a thick, heavy band of energetic compression or muscular constriction that locks the suboccipital muscles into a state of permanent defensive braking. This is the physical anchoring of a mind that is looking down into the body with intense, controlling surveillance. We are literally crushing the top of our own spine, clamping down on the very channels through which our life force flows, because we are terrified that if we relax the base of our skull, our wild, untamed animal nature will erupt without our permission. We are choking out our own spontaneous fluid dynamics, clamping our nervous system's gateway shut to maintain the appearance of the perfectly regulated student, while the explosive, creative life force within us is suffocated before it can ever touch the open air. From the base of the skull, this current of structural bracing travels downward and clamps with immense force directly into our pharyngeal constrictors and the epiglottis. When we live as a permanent somatic machinist, our throat muscles are forced to adapt to a state of chronic high-level hypervigilance, turning the upper airway into a mechanical brake used by the internal administrator to regulate the flow of raw emotional energy. If we observe our throat in this exact second, we will notice a persistent, subtle swallowing reflex or a tight knot of containment that prevents our voice from resting in its natural, unbuttoned register. We are structurally bracing our throat as if we are trying to squeeze our human nature into a rigid blueprint of alignment. This chronic constriction keeps our brain permanently alerted to the presence of an internal predator, ensuring that our thoughts remain frantic, analytical, and obsessed with error detection, creating the very heart rate irregularities we are trying to cure and ensuring that the basement of repair remains our only comfortable home. The most paralyzing and hidden manifestation of this somatic freezing is localized deep within our abdominal wall, the solar plexus, and the visceral organs. When we fall into the trap of somatic perfectionism, our belly muscles are held in a rigid, overcorrected alignment that mimics a tight, rubbery sheet of tension, designed to keep our internal organs held in a static, predictable pattern rather than allowing them to shift fluidly with life. We refuse to let our belly drop, We refuse to let our internal organs sag or gurgle with the natural messy rhythm of an animal, and we refuse to move with the loose, unpredictable rhythm of a living ecosystem. This physical rigidity is the somatic expression of our deep refusal of life's unmanaged chaos. We are holding our lower torso in a state of permanent arrest, a physical containment that makes every step into an unpredictable relationship, a creative risk, or an unscripted conversation feel like a terrifying plunge into a dark abyss. We are literally locking our bones to keep ourselves from making a single mistake, choosing the clean, sterile safety of a permanent blueprint over the muddy, ecstatic reality of a fully lived day. This systemic physical tightening feeds directly back into a toxic, self-perpetuating psychological feedback loop that grows more sophisticated with every book we read and every metric we track. Because we have linked our right to fully inhabit the world to our physiological cleanliness, the analytical mind begins to treat our natural biological fluctuations as structural defects that disqualify us from receiving love or expressing power in the present hour. The moment we feel a wave of ordinary anxiety, a flash of irrational adrenaline, or a sudden dip into physical fatigue, the inner judge instantly flags these experiences as proof that our somatic renovation project is still incomplete. The mind whispers, "See, you are still unaligned, your nervous system is still dysregulated. You must go back down into the control room and complete another round of box breathing before you are allowed to speak." To escape the shame of this perceived failure, we subconsciously sabotage our own expansion, withdrawing from the very environments that could challenge us, postponing the projects that could liberate us, and hiding our true faces behind a thick lacquer of therapeutic perfectionism. We are actively punishing ourselves for the crime of being human, sacrificing the brilliant, raw, and unrepeatable currency of our current days to maintain an illusion of sanitization, completely blind to the reality that there is no finished version of us waiting at the end of the optimization rainbow, and that the only self we will ever have is the beautifully cracked, unfinished, and living sculpture that is breathing in this very room right now. To slice cleanly through this intricate, self-perpetuating fortress of somatic hypervigilance, we must bring the razor-sharp, cool surgical steel of the Buddha's insight directly into our internal control room, using it to dismantle the absolute illusion that our biological fluctuations are structural failures that disqualify us from existence. 2,500 years ago, standing on the raw, unpolished earth, a human being looked deeply into the cross-currents of human bondage and mapped the exact mechanical trap, where our search for physiological perfection becomes the ultimate architect of our suffering. He did not diagnose our nervous system spikes, our shallow breath, or our passing physical tensions as clinical pathologies to be hidden away behind tracking dashboards. He exposed our refusal to live inside our untamed, fluctuating nature as the primary engine of dukkha. When we look into our interior landscape and notice the inherent irregularity of our physical conditioning, the sudden acceleration of our pulse during an important meeting, the heavy drop of fatigue that crushes our limbs on a rainy afternoon, or the protective reflex that tightens our chest when we are about to speak an uncomfortable truth, we are being struck by the first arrow of reality. This first arrow is the natural, unalterable consequence of possessing a physical form made of the relative elements, what the ancient texts call kaya. It is the simple law of impermanence, anicca, expressing itself through the fluid weather patterns of our biological anatomy. No human being walks through this world with a completely flat, sanitized and permanently optimized physiological surface. The body is an open ecosystem, continuously responding to the unseen shifts of the earth, the barometric pressure, the emotional fields of others, and the passing of time. The first arrow is entirely neutral. It is the raw data of a living, breathing animal navigating a complex universe. But the modern mind, completely possessed by the fantasy of somatic mastery, refuses to let this raw biological data be neutral. The moment a wave of natural anxiety or physical contraction surfaces in our awareness, we reach back into our internal quiver, pull out a second arrow, and drive it with immense, screaming violence directly into the exact spot where the first arrow landed. This second arrow is the aggressive, unexamined internal verdict that declares, because your heart rate is elevated, you are dysregulated. Because your breath is shallow, your nervous system is broken. You must go back down into the control room and perform a box breathing protocol immediately to fix your state before you are allowed to exist. If we look closely at our existence right now, we will see that the profound exhaustion breaking our spirit is never caused by the actual sensations in our body. It is entirely manufactured by the devastating infection of this second arrow. The first arrow is the natural asymmetry of being flesh. The second arrow is the arrogant, perfectionist belief that we must become a sterile, disembodied machine before we are allowed to touch the world. We turn a perfectly workable, authentic moment into a private prison, sitting in our own rooms while our minds violently whip our biology for failing to achieve a state of physiological sanitization that does not exist anywhere in nature. To shatter the very foundation of this second arrow, the Buddha's wisdom requires us to look directly into the nature of the entity we are trying so desperately to optimize. The concept of the permanent, fixed body belonging to a separate ego, the illusion he completely deconstructed through the realization of non-self, anatta. The hyper-vigilant biohacker operates under the false assumption that the body is a static physical object, like a broken grandfather clock or a computer processor, that can be systematically rewired, hacked, balanced, and permanently dusted until it reaches an ultimate state of flawless execution. We believe that if we do enough somatic work, track enough metrics, and manage enough brainwaves, we will eventually cross a mythical finish line where our biology becomes a completed, unshakable monument of absolute regulation. But wisdom points to a completely different, liberating reality. There is no solid, static body waiting to be finalized at the end of the optimization rainbow. The flesh is not a machine owned by the ego. It is a wild, self-regulating wilderness made of the great elements earth, water, fire, and wind, Mahabhuta. The body is a river of passing sensations, a continuous stream of heartbeats, nerve firings, metabolic shifts, and chemical tides rolling through our awareness. Trying to achieve a perfectly regulated body is like an architect trying to build a permanent monument out of water, or a traveler trying to tie a knot in a passing cloud. The more you try to manually adjust the gears of this fluid stream with your analytical blueprints, the more friction and stress you will introduce into the biology, turning your somatic journey into an infinite, exhausting loop of chasing your own tail. The moment we break through this illusion, an immense, breathtaking space opens up in the very center of our chest. We look at our pounding hearts, our shallow breaths, and our muscular contractions, and we realize a profound truth. The awareness that witnesses the sensation is already whole. The baseline consciousness that is currently listening to these words, the space that notices the compression at the base of your skull or the tight knot in your throat, has never been dysregulated, has never been traumatized, and has never been incomplete. The sky does not need to renovate the thunderstorms before it allows them to flash through its expanse. The ocean does not need to flatten its waves before it can mirror the light of the stars. When we shift our identity from the fluid, unfinished weather of our biology to the vast, empty sky of our fundamental awareness, the violent compulsion to manipulate our flesh before we live completely evaporates. We see that we do not need to wait for the somatic optimization project to end before we can invite the world into our palace. We can throw open the heavy doors of our existence, step out onto the raw earth, and live our lives right now in this very hour, while the pulse is still racing and the breath is still short. We see that our worthiness is not a variable score determined by a wearable health tracker, but an absolute, unconditioned reality that belongs to us by right of birth. We stop acting as the frantic machinist hiding behind diagnostic panels, and we step into the world with our vulnerabilities fully visible, our spine straight, and our heart unshielded, ready to create and love out of the fierce, ecstatic realization that our living wilderness already knows exactly how to breathe itself. To transition from the intellectual release of our administrative illusions into a lived, cellular liberation, we must enter the raw, physical construction site of our own somatic architecture. We cannot dismantle the fantasy of physiological mastery through the same analytical intellect that has spent years managing our internal tracking dashboards. For the mind is the very engine that draws the blueprints, schedules the regulations, and orders us back into the basement of nervous system containment. The poison of somatic perfectionism is written in the dense, silent language of our muscles, manifesting as a persistent, thick band of energetic compression at our occipital ridge, a mechanical break inside our pharyngeal throat muscles, and a rigid, rubbery sheet of tension that locks our abdominal wall. To rewrite this programming, we must bring the steady, warm laser of our embodied presence directly into the physical coordinates where these controlling reflexes are anchored. This architecture of transformation requires us to master 3 distinct daily inner practices that allow us to soften the base of the skull, release the manual control of the diaphragm, and celebrate the wild, unmanaged wilderness of our visceral organs within our beautifully unfinished lives. The first foundational pillar of this real-world alignment is the systematic practice of softening the occipital ridge and establishing the wide-angle body scan, because the hypervigilant somatic auditor archetype has spent years training our internal gaze to act as a predatory, checking microscope looking down into the spine and muscles to actively seek out defects, stress signals, or misalignments. We must perform a direct physical intervention to return our internal perception to its organic state of gentle inclusion. We engage this practice whenever we feel that familiar, heavy band of pressure tightening at the base of our skull, or when we catch ourselves scanning our shoulders and heart rate with the clinical detachment of an engineer inspecting a faulty machine. We begin by sitting flat on a chair or the floor, allowing our spine to find its natural vertical alignment without forcing a rigid posture. We close our eyes and bring our awareness directly into the suboccipital muscles located at the very top of our neck, right where the skull rests on the first vertebrae. Instead of treating this boundary as a command center from which the mind rules over the flesh, we visualize this entire zone melting like soft wax in the midday sun. We imagine a deep, warm current of fluid energy spreading laterally across the base of the skull, opening up the narrow channels through which our nerves and blood vessels travel. As this occipital compression dissolves, we deliberately change the quality of our internal awareness. We stop shining a sharp, narrow spotlight on individual tension points. Instead, we switch to a wide-angle body scan. We let our internal perception expand until it simultaneously holds our entire physical form, feeling the warmth of our feet on the floor, the heavy drop of our hips, the fluid movement of our rib cage, the coolness of the air on our skin, and the background pulsing of our blood as a single unified landscape of sensation. We do not analyze any single pattern, we do not diagnose our nervous system state, and we do not try to fix a single contraction. We allow our body to be felt as an organic whole, recognizing that the awareness witnessing these sensations does not need to look down with an iron fist, because it is already seamlessly woven through every cell of our flesh like light through water. This ocular and cranial softening provides the deep, spacious grounding required for our second discipline, the absolute relinquishing of manual regulation, or what we call the unsupervised exhalation. This is the art of taking our hands completely off the mechanical levers of our respiratory system, stopping all counting, matching, or tracking of breath length, and letting the lungs slide back into their primitive, animal rhythm. Whenever we sit down to rest and notice our mind immediately trying to hijack our breath, forcing us into a box-breathing technique, a specific retention ratio, or an artificial diaphragmatic expansion, to lower our heart rate, we must consciously choose to step away from the control panel. We take a deep natural inhalation through our nose, filling our chest and abdomen without checking a manual, and then, on a completely unedited, unsupervised exhalation, we let go of all effort. We let our mouth drop slightly open, and we allow the air to fall out of our body with a soft, passive sigh, feeling the breathing apparatus completely collapse into its own natural vacancy. We do not try to make the next inhalation deep. We do not try to make the next exhalation long. We sit as a completely passive observer, letting the respiratory center in our primitive brainstem decide exactly how much air our tissues require in this exact second. If the breath chooses to be shallow, thin, and rapid, we let it be shallow. If it chooses to drop into a deep, heavy pause at the bottom of the movement, we let it rest in that emptiness. We take our hands off the steering wheel entirely, allowing our diaphragm to move with the wild, uncalculated freedom of the wind rustling through an open meadow. As we watch our body breathe itself without our administrative interference, a profound, shocking relief washes through our nervous system. For we realize that our life force has never needed our mental management to survive, and that the biology has been running its own complex miracles perfectly well for millions of years before our intellect ever invented a tracking device. This somatic surrender opens the gateway for our third and most revolutionary discipline, the sacred feast of the wild viscera. This is the practice of immediate radical inclusion. Whenever an uncomfortable, intense physical symptom flares up in our body, training our awareness to let the biology cycle through its natural changes without trying to fix, heal, or override the sensation. We practice this sovereignty in the middle of our ordinary days, especially when a wave of intense physical anxiety, a sudden acceleration of our pulse, or a heavy drop of physical fatigue hits our frame. Instead of reaching into our pockets to check a digital tracker, and instead of running to our library of somatic techniques to perform an emergency regulation protocol, we place our hands loosely on our thighs, drop our chin slightly, and open the gates of our belly wide. We descend with our awareness straight into the center of the fire, right into the pounding of the heart, the fluttering of the stomach, or the cold knot in the solar plexus. We do not try to calm the heartbeat. We do not try to loosen the contraction. We throw a magnificent feast for these wild sensations right in the center of our temple, treating them not as clinical dysregulations to be cured, but as the raw, unpredictable expressions of nature itself. We look into the center of the internal storm, and we say to our tissues within our thoughts, "You are permitted to pound, you are permitted to shake, you are permitted to contract." The control room is permanently empty, and you do not need to be optimized to stay in this room. We feel a magnificent, explosive current of primal power rushing through our bones as the war against our own biology finally grinds to a halt. We discover that when we stop interfering with the natural intelligence of the flesh, the physical symptom ceases to be a dangerous trap. It becomes a fluid weather pattern that naturally rises, reaches its peak, and dissolves back into equilibrium entirely on its own schedule. We step out of the role of the somatic machinist once and for all, choosing the wild, indestructible reality of our unmanaged skin over the clean, dead geometry of an optimization manual, fully prepared to live and breathe as the vast, self-correcting wilderness we have always been. When we finally step out of the claustrophobic control room of our somatic surveillance and abandon the role of the biological machinist, an extraordinary, weightless stillness cascades through every single layer of our physical frame. This stillness is not the artificial, rigid quiet of a body that has been successfully drugged into submission by breathing protocols, nor is it the numb compliance of a nervous system that has been engineered to meet a clinical metric. It is the vibrant, fluid, and utterly unshakable peace of an untamed forest that has finally been left alone to regulate its own soil. The heavy, crushing compression at our occipital ridge dissolves into a broad, luminous river of energy that flows freely down our spine, allowing our neck and skull to rest in a state of primitive, effortless dignity. The mechanical brake inside our pharyngeal throat muscles snaps wide open, releasing our breathing into its natural, unbuttoned depth, and the tight, rubbery sheet of tension across our abdominal wall melts back into a soft, responsive cushion of vital life. We look down at our own limbs, and for the first time since we entered the trap of somatic perfectionism, we are fully, ecstatically content to simply inhabit the flesh we wear, entirely free from the toxic necessity to audit our biology against an optimization manual. The physical world outside our skin rushes back into our awareness with an exquisite, unshielded intensity that reveals our old, non-stop somatic hacking to be nothing but a bloodless, hyper-vigilant illusion. The texture of the air moving across our face feels remarkably dense and alive, interacting with our pores in a dance that does not require our administrative permission. The sudden acceleration of our pulse, the unexpected drop of our physical energy, or the natural, transient tightening of our chest during an intense conversation are no longer treated as structural failures that disqualify us from life. They are met simply as the beautiful, shifting weather patterns of a living animal resting in its own garden. When we walk through a crowded room or sit quietly in the early evening light, we feel our weight drop with immense, grounding authority into the very bottom of our pelvis, moving through the world not as an unstable biological machine that is perpetually on the verge of breakdown, but as a sovereign force of nature that has chosen to trust the primordial intelligence of its own design. This is the state of spontaneous resonance, the deep, cellular realization that your physical body is not a broken clock to be continuously repaired by the ego, but a self-correcting wilderness that already knows exactly how to pump its blood, digest its grief, and clear its stress without a single word of your mental supervision. We have returned to our true, unconditioned inheritance. We have stopped demanding that our biology become a sterile, digital machine before we allow ourselves to speak or create, and we have surrendered our spirit to the magnificent maternal network of nature running through our veins right now. We see that when we step away from the levers of manual regulation, we are not losing our balance, we are aligning our awareness with the boundless, unyielding intelligence that has sustained our ancestors through millions of years of unscripted history. We can close our tracking apps, we can lay down our polyvagal blueprints, and we can look at our ordinary, fluctuating physical states with a sense of quiet, unshakable reverence, knowing that this living wilderness is enough. In the uncompromising clarity of the deep insight tradition, the Buddha continuously pointed away from the frantic, controlling cravings of the egoic intellect, which seeks to possess a flawless, predictable mechanism and attach itself to an illusion of physiological sanitization, and directed our focus toward the raw, changing truth of the physical form exactly as it arises. He reminded us that liberation is never achieved by trying to force the fluid river of the relative elements into a static, conceptual grid, but by completely penetrating the immediate reality of our embodied existence with empty hands. He invited us to look beyond the glittering mirages of our optimized health metrics, to put down the heavy second arrow of our somatic interference, and to find the deep, unconditioned peace that exists when we finally allow our flesh to be as wild, as cracked, and as wonderfully alive as the earth itself. The afternoon light has shifted completely now, casting long, soft shadows across the floor that mimic the natural asymmetrical curves of our own bones. The flashing screens and diagnostic panels of our internal control room have dissolved entirely into the void, their heavy gears and rigid metrics vanishing like mist before the rising sun, leaving our body to stand fully bare, transparent and unshielded in the wide-open foreground of the present hour. Our hands rest loose and empty on our thighs, our fingers completely uncurled from the weapons of manipulation. A physical posture that signals to our entire nervous system that the war against our own biology is permanently over. We are no longer supervising a machine. We are no longer hacking a reflex. We are simply here, resting deeply within the vast cathedral of the flesh, allowing the heart to pound, the lungs to collapse, and the spirit to move out of the fierce, ecstatic realization that we are already entirely complete in our beautiful, unmanaged nature. If you finally took your hands off the mechanical levers of your own biology, if you dropped the heavy second arrow of somatic interference and permitted your flesh to breathe, beat, and feel itself without a single word of your administrative supervision, who would you be in this very unshielded second?